This is part 4 of Chapter 53's lecture, and we left off talking about the dependence or independence of density on the population's growth. So essentially, if you think of a population, they all stop growing at some point. So what is it that is going to influence that? What environmental factors are going to stop a population from growing indefinitely? Otherwise, our planet would be overrun with all the different populations. And another question we could ask is, why do some populations fluctuate in size while others remain relatively stable? So one area of ecology studies the regulation of populations and looks at the effects of increasing the population's density on the rate of the births and deaths, immigration and emigration. So if immigration and emigration are offsetting each other, then a population grows when the birth rate exceeds the death rate. And the population's density is going to decline when the death rate exceeds the birth rate. A birth rate or a death rate that does not change with the population density is called density independent. For example, there's a type of grass that grows on dunes that has a mortality rate that's due to physical factors that kill a similar proportion of a local population regardless of its density. We would say then that that death rate is going to be density independent because it doesn't matter how many plants are there, they're all going to die equally just because this particular factor kills whether there are a lot of them or a few of them. It doesn't really change the death rate. So that's considered a density independent factor. So before we go any further into these different types of factors, let's look again at what are density independent populations. So it really, if you think about, there's a lot of new terms being thrown at you in this chapter, but a lot of them really have to do with just common sense. Because if you think of something being density independent as a population, what that is saying is that no matter what the density of the population, the birth rate and the death rate aren't going to change very much. So what is going to actually favor this type of life history is a maximum reproductive rate because it doesn't matter on the density of the population. So we call that an R-selected density population. As opposed to, now in contrast, is what we call a K-selected population. And this one is actually very sensitive to how dense the population is. So it's called density dependent. So what that actually means is that if you get too many of the population, if it gets too dense, the birth rate falls and the death rate rises. So the population decreases when it becomes too dense. So that's called a case-selected population. And so natural selection is going to favor life history traits that are sensitive to the population density. So this, again, looking back at our survivorship curves, the ones that are more K-selected are those with a type 1 survivorship, and those that are more R-selected are those with a type 3 survivorship. This is another way to graph the way that we look at the different types of factors on whether they're density independent or density dependent. So you can pause this and actually look over it and study it so that it makes sense to you. But basically what this is used for is to determine where there's an equilibrium for just the perfect population density. So if you look at this as the births or death rate per capita So the higher it is, obviously the less dense the population is going to be because they have a death or birth rate that's being affected. And this is how dense the population is. So this is an increasing density here. So if you have a high birth and death rate per capita and a very low population density, then you're going to have here more density independence. So when a population density is low, it means the birth rate is greater than the death rate, birth versus mortality. As a result, the population grows until the density reaches Q, which is the equilibrium density here. So we're moving in this direction. When the population density is high, so we're moving in this direction, meaning the mortality rate is greater than the birth rate. In this case, mortality rate is greater than birth rate here. The population shrinks until the density reaches Q. So the mortality will increase over birth rate so that we can get back to the Q here. This quadrant shows you where the density independent death rate is. And this line right here shows you where the density dependent birth rate is. So density-dependent birth and death rates are an example of a negative feedback loop that regulates the population's growth. And the density-dependent birth and death rates are affected by many factors. Things like competition for resources, territoriality, disease, predation, toxic waste, intrinsic factors within individuals in the population. All of those are factors that would be called that are called K-selected population factors. So things like, again, competition for resources, things that have to do with, that are going to be affected by how dense the population is. So, for example, disease is going to spread more quickly when there's a large density of population. Predation is going to affect it more. Toxic wastes are going to affect it more. Territoriality, competition for resources, all of those things are going to be case-selected factors because they are very closely aligned with how dense the population is. When we're talking about that rate of increase of a population, there are formulas that you will be given on the test, but you need to be able to interpret what the formula is telling you. So R in this case is the per capita rate of increase. And the way that we calculate that is by figuring out how many births there are, how many immigrants there are, and subtract how many deaths there are with how many immigrants there are leaving. So if the immigration and emigration are ignored, the population's growth rate is going to be basically the birth rate minus the death rate. Mathematically, this is the formula that we would be looking at, where R again is the rate of growth. Delta means a change, and change in this case, a population size is N. Over the time period that we're measuring this, the change in time is going to equal the number of births minus the number of deaths. So the birth rate minus the death rate. I just want to point out that this delta sign, sometimes you're going to see this written as R equals dn over dt, and d is just a substitute. It means the same thing. So again, this is another look at the formula when we're looking at the growth rate of a population. Mathematically, that R can be represented by that delta N over delta T. So that's, again, it's just a figure that is telling you that represents the actual rate of growth of the population. And we are just saying that it's going to be equal to the number of births minus the number of deaths over time. Births and deaths can be expressed as an average number. Boy, this is a messed up slide, isn't it? There we go. As the average number of births and deaths per individual during a specified time interval. So births can be the number of births times the total population size. The annual per capita birth rate is that B, and M is the mortality, the per capita death rate. So again, thinking, what does rate mean? It means the amount of change that's occurring over a period of time. So this is another way of writing how population growth can be depicted, where this is the growth rate, the delta n over delta t, times the actual per capita birth rate minus the per capita death rate. Now the thing on this side I want to point out is what ZPG means, and that stands for zero population growth, which means that the birth rate simply equals the death rate, or the R here is equal to 0. Now, another way simplifying our formula, we can write this formula as the rate of growth, the change in the population size over time, is equal to the rate of growth, the per capita growth rate, times the actual size of that population at a particular moment. Okay, and this is actually just summarizing the exact same thing, so we'll go right through that. Now we can have different types of growth rates. We can have either what's called exponential, or we can have logistic growth rate. So when we have a maximum growth rate occurring, we are saying that we're approaching an exponential growth rate. So that R max is the maximum growth rate times the population size. So in this case, you get a graph that looks something like this. What's happening is that the per capita birth rate is exceeding the death rate. So the population is increasing and our R value is positive. But when we have the death rate exceeding the birth rate, so B is less than M or D, R, which is our growth rate, is negative and the population is decreasing. So if you have a negative R, you have a decreasing population. If you have a positive R, you have an increasing population. So when do we have this rapid growth rate that seems to be going on and on and on? Well, it doesn't happen a lot in nature because, again, we don't expect a population to continue to exponentially grow. But it does occur in certain populations. One of those would be in a population that was perhaps close to extinction that is now on the rebound. And so an example that's shown here is the African elephant population in South Africa. And so what you see here is an exponential growth rate occurring over the time period as there was a conservation and a decrease on poaching that occurred in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that has led to this exponential growth rate. Another place that you're going to see this, well, actually, we'll get to that in a second. But here we have many short-lived organisms like E. coli, bacteria, have a relatively high R max value. So again, R is the rate of growth. And when that value is high, you get a very close to exponential growth.